Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this particular session entitled Memorializing and Identifying Sacred Grounds with Student Experiences. I am Dr. Alicia Nguyen, Applied Cultural Anthropologist. I am the founder of Consider the Culture, A.R. Wing Scholar Consultant. As an applied anthropologist, I use anthropology to solve contemporary problems, and I'm also a faculty, adjunct faculty at Palm Beach Atlantic University. And I've had the opportunity to, one, teach students in and outside the classroom, but as well as work with organizations, and particularly heritage organizations, in which I'm going to talk briefly about in this whole process of the session, but then, but also in the role that they play. So just give you a brief background. I'm gonna go back to this slide, but this will give you a background of what we're gonna talk about today. Is throughout the history across the country, the state and the city, historic African-American cemeteries and burial sites have been neglected, built over, unrecognized, and devalued. And so this session will explore the sites and cemeteries, how communities memorialize them, and student instruction. And so we're going to focus on the ways to engage students in remembering those they have lost, connect to sacred spaces, and create ways to highlight these topics. Because I think it's so important, and especially even the climate of our country and what we're going through right now, how we remember people we've lost. And unfortunately, you know, we've seen this all too consistent. And so, as you can see, I'm sure, you know, everybody knows about what's happened in this country, what's still happening in this country, and with George Floyd, and the countless number of people of color who have been devalued, dehumanized, and killed for quote unquote several reasons, but no reasons at all. And so I thought this image was appropriate based upon this title and how we memorialize people and what is considered sacred. I actually saw on the news today, this morning, how in Minneapolis, the site where Mr. George Floyd was killed, that this site has been, what they actually use the term sacred space, where everyone understands, whether you're a protester or a agitator, in which they use those terms, they know that this area you don't mess with, you don't cause chaos in this particular area, because it's considered sacred grounds. It is sacred space. And even just how people identify what is considered sacred ground. So it's an interesting dynamic where this space has become sacred, yet a Black body is not considered sacred enough to be valued in life to continue. And so I think it's appropriate for us as educators, but as students, to understand these sacred spaces and the people that are connected to them. And so we'll come back. And so for those who want to participate, because I want to get your input, and I think it's very important just to start off, how do you remember and honor those who you have lost? And if anybody, you know, whether all of you or just a couple of you, whoever feels comfortable, I just want to ask, you know, what have been ways that you have remembered and honored those that you have lost in your life, whether it's a family member, friend, co-worker. So is there anybody want to share how you honor and remember those individuals, or in an individual? No one? Okay.
I'm here. I'll go ahead and do it.
Okay. All right.
I try to honor the memory of those of our lost. I can, you know, think about family members, my mother, my grandmother, and just my actions and the decisions that I attempt to make throughout the day. Just the things that I do, and just understanding just the prayers that they've, you know, the times that they've prayed for me, and just the wishes and hopes that they had for my life. And I try to bring it into fruition through my actions.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else? No one? Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Knowles, and I think that is something that I do too. I would try to remember, honor those who I've lost in what I do. in how I say it, and people have various ways in how they honor. As you can see, Mr. George Floyd, you see how people are honoring him, and other people honor, with rest in peace t-shirts and flowers, and, continuing a tradition. So there are many different ways that people do that, and how important that is and what that means. One of the things I did ask these questions where I worked with, and Jonathan Taylor, who's on the line, can even add to this if he like at this point. When I usually go to after school programs with youth, and particularly middle school and high school students. And I also do presentations with students actually at the school. And one of the things I did with the PAL Center youth is we talked about the storm of 28. And one of the things I asked them was, how do they remember and honor those they've lost? And they gave the most powerful responses, and and something that it was opportunity for them to talk about and express, how they dealt with it or not. It was opportunity for me to see how they're dealing with loss, because many of them talked about, they've lost friends who they've to gun violence, they've lost their grandmother. And so it was a very therapeutic session with just these young people who were middle school and high school students. And so I think it is important, as we're working with young people, and we'll talk about this in the end, to, if they feel comfortable, to talk about how they honor those they've lost. And I'll go through it a little bit more. And so this was a quote from my colleague. It says, "The denial of the dead is one of the greatest injustices that can be done. It is both an attempt to erase the bodies of the dead and an open assault on the memories of the living that knew and loved them. It is an injustice that creates a deep and festering wound." And he was referring to actually this kind of dismissal of honoring those we've lost. And he was angry, and he was referring to one of our national leaders in response to their actions of not actually recognizing and denying those that we've lost. And he identified it as an injustice, something as almost a crime to do so. And the question I asked is, why is that? Why is it to just dismiss the bodies of people or the lives of individuals, and where does that come from, and particularly people of color? And so I always have to go back to, as an anthropologist, and looking at the history and where this kind of idea even comes from, to even devalue or not recognize human beings, and even in life, and then let alone death. And so you always have to go back to the history and the origin of how people view human beings and different quote unquote types of human beings. So I always look at the history of the classification of humans. Of course, back in the day, you had different people, Linnaeus, that categorized living things, whether it was plants and animals. But then, and you start moving into a particular, the 18th and 19th century, you start seeing this shift of classifying or justifying the classification of human beings, and particularly by scientists. And so between the 18th and 20th century, you see people like Blumenbach and doing biased research and putting human beings in categories. And so they put, Mongolian, American Indian, Caucasian, Malay, and Ethiopians. You see, this justification of doing this. And it was a hierarchical framework. So of course, if you are creating a classification system, and putting people in categories, if I am the creator of the game, I'm definitely not going to put myself at the bottom. We're not going to be modest if I'm creating the game. We're not going to be modest when we're classifying people and say, oh, well, I'll just go to the bottom. No, you're going to put yourself at the top, and then you're going to put those others at the bottom. But when you do that, you have to justify it. And how do you justify it? You stamp science and you stamp God on it, and no one questions it. And so this is what tend to happen, and so you see Linnaeus categorizing people. Europeans are white, Africans black, American Indians is red, Asians is yellow, and then Blumenbach, of course, as you can see, those skulls come along in 1776 and put people in these categories. And then on top of that, he said, you know, looking at a skull in the, for instance, in the Caucasus Mountain, it was a woman that of human remains they found, and they said that, you know, this resembles God himself. And so now you add in God on top of it. And so people don't question, and particularly back in that time, question scientists, you know, and so people start studying head shapes and body shapes, and, you know, the size of your knee and the size of your foot, comparing individuals, and without the consideration of cultural differences, without the consideration of climatic differences, or even environmental differences of, you know, in certain African cultures where people do head binding, in Native American cultures, they bind their heads so their heads are shaped, and it may have to do with cultural reasons. But, you know, even the slightest difference is something type of a justification for those who are scientists and those who are in charge to determine, you know, who's greater and who is not greater. And so, however, you know, there is no agreement of how many differences it take the race. You know, it is a biological construct to classify people as human and subspecies, and there is no agreement about, does it take a little bit of dark skin, does it take a little bit of straighter hair, how do you determine what is a particular race? In actuality, studies have found that there's more genetic differences within a group than out in between. And so if I'm standing next, for instance, next to Mr. Knowles, and there are probably more differences between he and I than me and a person that would be considered white. Or a person that would be considered Asian. We may not have the same blood type. So it's not as based on our skin color. You need to look at something a little bit deeper. However, this social construction becomes, you know, the truth. It becomes the end all be all. So what happens is, what you see here, what is defined or perceived by people as real is real in its consequences. So it doesn't matter that there is no scientific proof of, you know, these differences between groups of people based upon phenotypical differences. That's, you know, hair texture and skin color and eye shape. There's no differences, but what has been perceived as real has become the truth. And what people see it is real. It is real to them, despite the social construction. And so what you get is something like this, you know, this in protest, and even this fear of, you know, identifying groups of people based upon how they look, and then you associate behaviors connected to it. You know, the stereotypes of, I'm a Black woman, so there are certain things tied to being a Black woman. You know, stereotypically, you know, Black people, quote unquote, eat watermelon and fried chicken, and I have, you know, 3 baby daddies, I'm on food stamps, you know, I'm on Section 8. All of these things are connected to this stamp of inferiority and these stereotypes. So therefore, it is justified if I am gunned down. It is justified that I am dismissed, because I am, one, first of all, subhuman. Then attached to that are behaviors that do not deserve to be in society. And so what happens to that is the real consequences of a social construction. And so this devaluing kind of builds upon itself and builds upon itself consistently. And so what you start seeing is, you know, laws coming into play, and justification of those laws based upon hierarchy, based upon science, based upon religion, and based upon stereotypical ideas placed on human beings. And so here you see Jim Crow laws and segregation laws come into play with the US. You see the 1-drop rule. If you have 1 drop of considered Black blood or African ancestry, you are considered Black, or and or you are 3/5 human. So you're not even human. Therefore, anything can happen to you. You are property. And so you see examples of that, and we'll talk about the African burial ground and even apartheid. It should be a 1 in front of that 9 between 1948 and 1992. You see apartheid going on in South Africa, where Europeans who are, who are considered people of European descent, are 4.2 million people at the time, are discriminating against and have power over 25 million Black African people. Think about that. You got 4.2 million white people of European descent in another continent, coming from another continent into South Africa and dominating and having power or oppression over 25 million Black African people. And then you see how long this lasted, this apartheid here. And the justification goes back to what I said in my previous slides. And then you have things like where you see the African burial ground and what happened in African burial ground. And I'll talk briefly about that. And for those who haven't been to New York or have experienced that, in 1991, construction workers actually uncovered 6.6 acres, a portion of what they discovered is an African burial site in the lower Manhattan area. And what they found, that this was an unmarked cemetery developed over buildings, people built over a cemetery of 6.6 acres of land of a cemetery. And then this happened in 1991. They brought on Mr. Michael Blakely, who was a Black archaeologist at Howard University at that time. And what they discovered was unbelievable, but believable at the same time. And as you can see, this is some archaeologists, and this was very controversial because you had the community that was concerned about, how you cared for or not, or disturb the ground. Because when it was discovered that it was a burial ground or a cemetery, some of the community, particularly the Black community, wanted to leave it alone, let them rest. It is sacred ground. But then you also had researchers who wanted to find out who these individuals are, where they're coming from, and the history connected to him. And so they did a compromise with Dr. Blakely, who's African-American, by the way, researcher and archaeologist. And so what they did was they came together, they did what is called an excavation of that site, and they found out that these were African people. Because when you don't think about slavery in New York, but it was through doing this research and this excavation that they discovered that these were African people. What ended up happening is they reinterred the bodies after they did the research of who they were. And they had a beautiful ceremony, as you can see, those beautiful coffins, casing coffins at the top right, and reinterred them. And as you can see, these are images when I visited there in 2011, I believe, or 2012. As you can see, the raised the mounds, they purposely did that because they wanted people to not miss the fact that people are buried there. So you won't miss that something is buried there anymore, to cover them up again. So that was done intentionally in those sites where the coffins are buried in those mounds, underneath those mounds. And then, as you can see, they did a beautiful marble and granite memorial where you can actually read about the site, who's buried under there, and why it's important. Here's another image of it, as you can see, on Elk Street, and even naming it African Burial Ground Way. And they have these beautiful symbols to do so. I'm sorry. Uh-oh. Let me make sure I'm plugged up. Hold on. I'm sorry. All right, sorry about that. So you have these beautiful symbols of religious backgrounds from organizations and religious institutions, and that in the middle is like a globe of the world. So it's a beautiful memorial. If you ever go there, if you haven't been there, once things clear up, I encourage everyone to visit there, to remember how they remember. And the community worked very hard to make sure that the stories told, and you can go there to honor those who are buried in the ground. And so the next, I thought it was appropriate to actually talk about what happened on June 16th, 1976. I was watching Cry Freedom and the other day, and I thought it was so interesting to identify, where 15,000 uniformed students between the ages of 10 and 20 were marching that day, and to protest apartheid. And as a result of what happened, several hundreds of young people were shot and killed during this protest by police officers. And this was a horrible day because they just opened fire on these young people and shot and killed them during this time. And it's interesting because we're coming up on the anniversary of this particular event. But again, you see a horrific history, and it goes back to the devaluing of lives, but also still remembering it. And so I thought it was appropriate to identify, what happened on this day in Soweto, and memorialize them and remember them as this anniversary is coming up, which was 44 years ago. And so here's another quote. This is by Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. Southern Blacks, especially poor ones, are viewed as the worst combination of troubled elements: region, race, and class that on their own make life difficult enough. They are stereotyped as being backward, belligerently opposed to enlightenment, and tethered to self-defeating cultural habits that undermine their upward thrust from life, impunity, and ignorance. And this is taken from his book on Come Hell or High Water, Hurricane Katrina. And this is when Hurricane Katrina happened. And those who may not know or remember, how people, and particularly poor people and people of color, were treated during Hurricane Katrina and basically neglected. You have to not look at people as human beings to devalue and neglect people in such a way. And so again, you see another example with Hurricane Katrina, this instance of understanding why people choose to dismiss or disvalue people in that way. And so how people are buried or how people are forgotten about plays a huge role in that, or how voices are what I call silenced. It stems from devaluing groups of people or individuals because they are not human in people's eyes, those who have that power to make those decisions. And so in 1928, on September 16, there was a huge storm. I would say the 1928 Hurricane Katrina. So imagine Hurricane Katrina in 1928 without all the resources and the things that we have today. And imagine that when the levees broke, the levees broke in Lake Okeechobee, flooding entire areas. And during this time, it was a Category 4 storm that crashed into the east coast of Palm Beach County, moved inland, and reached Lake Okeechobee that evening. So imagine a hurricane happening at night, which is the worst because you can't see anything. Topping the levee, drowning over 2,500, I would say, to 3,000 people who lived in Belgrade, Chosin, Pahokee, and Bean City. People said during that time it was the greatest loss of life of Black Americans in a single day during that time. The majority, and so at this time, in this particular time, it was so many, you couldn't bury people quick enough because, think about 1928 when there's so many thousands of people that are hundreds of people dead everywhere. and you had to, do something with the bodies. Some bodies were burned, some bodies were buried, some bodies where you could not bury in this particular area. You talk about Belglade, where you got the muck and you got that wet soil, where bodies had to go different places. And several hundreds of those bodies came to West Palm Beach and Port Mayaca, which is north of here. And as you can see, you see bodies in nice little wooden boxes. And for some people, that was reality. For Black people, and particularly in West Palm Beach, that was not their reality. And so in West Palm Beach, what was brought over was hundreds of bodies. 60 of the white victims were put in a mass grave site at Woodlawn Cemetery. However, 674, I say plus bodies, were sent to where is 25th and Tamarind, and a mass grave site on 25th and Tamarind. Dump trucks hauled 674 bodies from Belglade, Chosen, and South Bay in a 20-foot deep hole. And the bodies were unidentified, but thought to be Black by their physical characteristics. The site, which I'll go here, and I'll come back to this particular site. The site was originally a slaughterhouse, a pump station, and a sewage plant for the city. Gave the grave a marker, and it's for 74 years after the storm, it was not identified. 74, think about that, right up the street in our city for 74 years. The land was purchased in 1915 for dumping purposes. So it was a dump site, but it was also a pauper cemetery. If Black people were not able to properly bury or have the funds to bury their loved ones, they buried their loved ones in this particular site on 25th and Tamarind. But it also was a place that was kind of often forgotten. If you drive by there, I grew up here, and I never knew for a long time what this particular area was. And so when you go back to, I'm going backwards, but Port Mayaca has a nice remembrance of, there's a mass grave there. And particularly in this particular area, Belglade has monuments about what happened at the on 1928 storm. And however, for 74 years, there was no indication by the city about what happened and who's buried in that ground. Now, the Black community knew about it. I remember my parents saying their bodies buried there. And my father, as a little boy, said they would run by this site because they were scared, because they knew bodies were buried there. And there's stories after stories of even storm survivors, and particularly the Black community, that talked about it. But, however, for 74 years, you see no recollection. So Mr. Robert Hazard, activist and founder of the Storm of 28 Coalition, Memorial Park, he fought to make sure this site was recognized and identified. And even when it wasn't like this and what you see today, this image right here, when it was nothing, he was fighting. This is a memorial service from 1998. He would come out and recognize the people buried under this ground, and recognize this site, and work very hard to make sure that this site was recognized and identified. And as a result of that work, you see here what you see today. In 1928, you see in the black fence is where the 674 bodies, unidentified, mostly Black migrant workers, are buried right here in this site. So it was very intentional to identify this particular area. But like I said again, it was considered a cemetery. So that whole entire site is sacred ground, not just behind that black fence. However, you still see indications of, even though this site was recognized, and this was the site in which their eyes were watching God, in which Zora Neale Hurston talks about in her book. And so these are just some of the features at the mass grave site. However, just recently, just a few years ago, you saw, and some of you who are from West Palm Beach may have seen a lot of construction, and that construction occurred right next to this particular cemetery. The Northwood Connection Project by the Florida Department of Transportation decided to connect the existing South Florida corridor and the Florida East Railway. And so the goal was to put a railway right coming down 25th Street, cross going from west to east, connecting the railway. And if you look at the image, the top image to the right, that is where the mass grave site is. And so as a result, and we found out a little bit later that that's what they were doing. It was interesting how they did the community engagement, because some of the community engagement existed in the Northwood population. However, we and the African American community, and particularly Coleman Park and Pleasant City, were not clearly informed that this was actually going on. And so as you can see, this is the construction. Again, this is construction going east on 25th Street. So to the right, again, is the mass grave site. And if you know any history about the mass grave site and the cemetery, technically the cemetery extends further north, across 25th Street. So there are possible bodies underneath that ground, even right what you're looking at right now. Historically, in the plots, there were plots of bodies buried across the street. However, in the 1950s, they put a road, which is 25th Street, over the cemetery. So the cemetery technically was kind of cut off. And so now you got another covering of sacred space again. And so just to give you an example again of think about, memorializing, valuing, unrecognizing again, and so now if you look at the proximity between the mass grave site, and that's the bottom right, you see on 25th and Tamarind where the arrow is the bottom right, just slightly east, northeast is what is Evergreen Cemetery. And then I'll talk briefly about Evergreen. And as you can see how close that is, you see again sacred ground. And in between, this is considered the what is it called? The industrial district of West Palm Beach. And so it's a lot of warehouses in between there. And so just to give you a brief history about Evergreen Cemetery. Evergreen Cemetery was established in 1913. It was organized and ran by all Black people. And a group of African Americans organized and purchased 9 acres of land to be used for burial ground. It is believed to be the first cemetery incorporated in the state of Florida. Very historic. And to be privately owned and operated by Black people. Its original charter of the nonprofit organization was approved on June 14, 1916. There are many prominent figures in this particular cemetery. I would call the Black First, Mildred Gildersleeves, the first Black midwife, Dr. T. Leroy Jefferson, the first Black doctor, and several others are particularly in this particular cemetery. Here's another image of them, and as you can see, the image is at the bottom. There is, because of its age and it's gone through a lot of deterioration, there have been a lot of groups that have assisted to clean up and the upkeep, even though the cemetery is owned by the city. Now, it was owned by that group of prominent Black people from 1913 to all the way up to probably the 1970s or 80s, but now it's owned by the city. But there are some challenges of the upkeep, and particularly in this historic cemetery. In actuality, I found my great-great-grandmother in this particular cemetery. Again, I didn't even know she was buried in the cemetery, which is a whole nother, topic of why I didn't know. If I didn't know, a lot of people don't know that this particular area and the importance of educating and highlighting, these particular areas. And so, and lastly, the last local cemetery I'm going to briefly talk about is the Sugar Hill Memorial Park Cemetery, which another cemetery which is uncovered and is what is considered Riviera Beach, in Riviera Beach. This cemetery is, if those who maybe know about Hilltop Baptist Church, which is, I believe, is on 30th or 31st Street. It is right up the street. As you can see, you see the church to the church. This is Hilltop here. And then right up the street here is Sugar Hill Memorial Cemetery. Sugar Hill was considered part of Kelsey Park, which is considered what is today is Lake Park. And this particular cemetery has a very, very, very interesting history in itself. This particular cemetery were a Black cemetery, and this cemetery was uncovered just I think in 2000, maybe early 2000. A lot of the people that are buried here are descendants from Rosewood. If you know anything about the Rosewood massacre in 1923, where black people's homes were burnt, and it was Rosewood is North Florida, where it was a Black community that was burned down, rioted against by white people. A lot of Black people were killed. So some of the survivors actually came and moved down and migrated to Palm Beach County and settled in Kelsey Park and this particular area. And so many of the individuals buried in this cemetery are Rosewood survivors. And this particular cemetery was uncovered by construction workers that were about to build on top of this cemetery. And so in 2006, Riviera Beach officials and residents, they came together and they actually cleaned up the cemetery and restored the cemetery. And what they did is they did an honor of it. So now it's a park. And so you can actually walk through. They have some sitting areas in this particular neighborhood. You can walk right down the street and pass by. But most people don't realize it's right there. And so again, here is another example of a Black cemetery, unrecognized, uneven heard of, and have the survivors of the Rosewood massacre that are settled in this particular neighborhood. And so again, the consistent themes of the challenges and considerations just of a Black community's cemetery or mass grave site. You see this lack of equity in restorations and maintenance of Black neighborhoods and their grave sites. And so these are just some challenges and considerations of what needs to happen, particularly in this area. And I'm showing this because this will tie in even in the application of working with students. And so clearing of trash, restoring fences, lawn maintenance, value of life and death from natural disasters, reducing park environment to multiple use with Evergreen Cemetery, unknown location and history, restoration of graves, recording of buried individuals and families, because there is not a major system. Like it's hard to find like who's buried there. If you wanted to identify, who's buried in what location, it's very difficult to do that at Evergreen, and a risk of continued damage. And so these are some of the challenges with particularly these two cemetery spaces. And so the question is, how do, as educators and working with young people, how do we memorialize? How do we engage? How do we connect? And how do we create? And engaging and remembering and connecting to that sacred space, but creating and highlighting these particular topics. And so from my experience in my work with young people, I found it was very important to really look at, the ages of young people based upon where they would go and how they work. Because when you think about a cemetery, it may be a little eerie and a little scary to youth and to certain youth. However, my experience, even with the PAL kids, it wasn't a scary experience. And it wasn't a scary experience, one, because I came in and educated them about the history of the mass grave site on 25th and Tamarind, but they also were engaged in and responsible for cleaning up the mass grave area for a certain amount of time. They volunteered their time, that group, to clean up that particular area. So that kind of broke away that fear of that site, because they got an education and background about it, and they were responsible. So they had some sense of empowerment and some sense of responsibility for that site. Therefore, there wasn't this sense of, oh, this is a cemetery and people, it wasn't an eerie thing. And so there were certain steps that was necessary to do that. And that would be the same case with Evergreen Cemetery. Have students identify and or compare similarities of major events that led memorials in their own lives. So it's very important. And as I said at the beginning, that question I asked the group, you all, was how do you honor and memorialize those if you lost? And asking students that question is very important as a way to engage and get them kind of their minds to really connect themselves to empathizing and relating to these historical sites. And so having them to express themselves, whether it's cultural expression, whether it's through art, through images, rest in peace t-shirts, as I mentioned, those different ways to how they can express themselves. So you use these historical sites as one educational tool, but you have them utilize their own cultural expressions as a therapeutic tool, as well as learning their history at the same time. And these through cleanups, through cleanups and getting them involved and active in cleaning up these sites will show how important Black cemeteries are, and how the threat of extinction and their role in helping that will help and assist in that. And the use of technology. We're in a technology age where our young people know about, Snapchat and TikTok and even the things I don't even know about, but have them utilize in taking pictures and recording and utilizing apps, and having them come up with their own ways of preserving history, their own ways of cultural expression, their own ways of even being able to understand and be educated about these historical sites. But however, at the same time, I thought about, once young people learn about what they did in the past, and then they're looking at what's happening today and how lives are devalued, what does that do to them internally? And so we have a responsibility as educators also to teach self-love and self-worth, and say, yes, this has happened, but you are valued, you are loved. And so therefore teaching our own is so important, dispelling the myths of what they've been seeing on TV and what they've been told and lied to about themselves. So this is an opportunity for re-education, to give them a confirmation that there is self-worth, there is self-love, you are great. There have been so many contributors to our community, and even the cemetery in Evergreen expresses that. I mean, there's so many prominent, educated Black people that are buried there. So that's an educational opportunity to let them know about the Black firsts are buried in that cemetery. So that's an opportunity to educate them, to dispel this myths of Black people not able to do anything or not valued. And so these are just different tools and how that can be utilized and with that knowledge. Even, this is from anthropologists, portrayals of minorities as defiling and threatening have been used to order society internally and to demarcate the boundaries of society beyond which lie those who do not belong. And so this is what young people and even in our society have been seeing, like, we don't belong, therefore we're not valued. But teaching young people a different view, despite of what they see, and re-educating them, dispelling this myth that you do belong, you do have value, you do have rights, and how you can activate that and look at the power within to do so. And so just lastly, this was such a powerful image to me. I found this on Facebook, and this is a young man who's graduating this year. I don't know what city he's in, but I thought it was so symbolic to see this. Him in his cap and gown standing in the backdrop of police and protesters, where young people have a story. They're in a time where in a time I never would imagine I could even be in, but they are experiencing so many different emotions and seeing so many different things. They are part of a global pandemic and a global rebellion against the injustices of people of color. And so this is an opportunity as educators to have them utilize what they've seen, record what they've seen, and express their feelings within, and learn about how powerful they are. The fact that he's able to stand there very calmly and peacefully in the midst of chaos says a lot about our young people. And so I think it's important to take things like this to kind of reaffirm them that, you know, the sky's the limit. You're more powerful than people expect of you. And so I thought this was important to end with. And so these are just a couple books that we don't have to go to. But if you have any questions at this point, I'm going to open up the floor if anyone has questions or want to add to ways that, you know, we can utilize what's happening today and in the past to educate our youth and empower our youth. So thank you.
This is Jonathan here. I'd like to just make a quick comment if possible.
Sure.
And of course, thanks to Dr. Nguyen for her work on this particular presentation. It was very informative. As a former program director and for the Police Athletic League, you know, I always think it's important to, especially when you're dealing with certain communities, to know where you are, to be able to empower and impact the youth that you work with. And to her point, many of our kids at the PAL Center were eerie to the fact of going to a gravesite. I can remember the day that we passed out the permission slips, and they're like, "Mr. JT, we're not going to no gravesite." I'm like, "What do you mean?" "Oh, it's dead people out there." But once again, to Dr. Nguyen's point, once they were given the history of the storm of 1928 and understood what took place, their whole perception of the situation and that historical site totally changed. And then we went there and we painted some of the benches, we cleaned up some of the shrubbery, we raked up leaves, and they were very, you know, receptive and excited to be there. So I think it is it's a process to introduce them to it and letting them understand, you know, the history that they pass by every single day. And we all would agree, you can't know where you're going until you know where you've been, right? So I think giving them that ability to understand that there's so much honor and pride and so many things around you that you could really be excited about, because there's people that came before you that really paved the way. And of course, if they don't know that and those people are laying to rest and being memorialized right around the corner from them, they may not know, you know, what direction they need to go in, which is a point to that picture of the young man standing, you know, with his cap and gown on in the middle of chaos. And some of our kids, particularly that's in the historic Northwest, Coleman Park, Pleasant City area, they are in the midst of chaos, in the midst of turmoil, because of everything that goes on in that particular area. But when they can know that the Evergreen Cemetery is right there, and the people that are buried in there, and the people that are buried in the mass grave of Night 28 is there, and the importance and how that really changed how we do things, you know, I think it's really, really important. And really, one other tidbit, my great-grandmother was actually a survivor of the 1928 flood, and she wrote an article, and we found it in her We found it in her closet, hidden away after she passed away. She passed away at 89, but she told the story of how the water was rising and how they ended up in the rafters of the shack that they were in. And by the grace of God, one of our family members who had came back from the Navy was a swimmer. And he ended up being able to save them, or being able to have them, find rafts to hold on to.
Wow.
And it's very empowering for me to know that when you know where you come from and the people that fought for your survival, it can definitely change everything about what you do. So I appreciate you guys, and I thank you all for what you do when it comes to history and working with the students in the Palm Beach County.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. That's very powerful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Anybody else had questions or want to add, or? Yes.
Yeah, real quick, Dr. Wynn. Excellent presentation. In so many ways, like you had my face just completely just glued to the screen, just listening to all the things that you said, and just how deep that you've kind of contextualized everything as far as like the classification of race and just going into the very origins of race, and just how important and critical just this one presentation is to just the young minds out there, and as far as how we can take this and utilize it in education. I remember in my undergrad, one of my college professors, and I got my undergrad in history, said that history doesn't repeat itself. That's just like a myth when people say history repeats itself, because every historical event has different variables, which makes it impossible that it repeats itself. But based on some of the current events and even some of the things that you said in that presentation, that's a false statement. History does repeat itself.
Right.
And especially when we're talking about the histories and the things that you mentioned, like, for example, the storm of 28 and bridging it with Hurricane Katrina. We're looking at some of the current protests today in our cities, looking at what happened in Los Angeles in 91. Then even yesterday was the 99th year anniversary of the Tulsa, the Greenwood massacre. Then even one of my colleagues were talking about how she's looking at all just the protests and the rebellions. I don't like to call them riots. I like to call them rebellions that are taking place throughout this country, and how it reminds her of the summer of 1967. And why I can go back to why I disagree, the variable is racism. All right, the variable is systemic and institutional racism. And part of why racism is being able to stay alive, because the things that you mentioned in it, just the greatness of what Black people have done, and also the origins of racism and the classification of race. That racism and institutional racism is very much alive. Even racism and attitudes is still alive because it's being perpetuated through our learning and through what's being taught in our classrooms. And this is an opportunity that the teacher can take some of the things that you've brought into this presentation and inspire our children. One of the things that you're saying as far as memorialization and how students can and impel social action, which ties in perfectly with the theme of this conference. Because if miseducation can inspire social action in a negative way, if we do education the right way, that we can inspire social action among our children in a positive way. And how, as a Black student, how this empowers us. And also how this benefits white students as well, because they can understand what's going on, and those racist attitudes that have probably been passed down through their generations can be broken. So this is extremely powerful in so many ways. So we thank you for bringing us this knowledge and expertise to us. So thank you.
No, thank you. And I'm glad you said that, because, this type of history in education, of course, is for our Black and brown students. However, it is for our white students too, because to help explain certain things, because, you get things, why are you so angry? Or what is the problem? But, understand this is a repeated devaluing, repeated classification, repeated stereotypical ideas of people of color that leads to behaviors against people of color, people will understand that a little bit better, how this has been embedded into what you said, systematic and institutional racism. Even in death, it is shown. And when you see that, and you've grown up your whole life seeing that, yes, there is going to be some anger. and people understanding that, and particularly our white students are understanding that it will be helpful to them, even in how they view their fellow classmates. So I'm glad you shared that. That is so important to do that. So thank you. Good.
Thank you, Dr. Wynn.
Welcome. Okay. Is there anyone else or that had a question or wanted to share, or because if not, I'm not sure the next step, but thank you all for staying on and being a part of it. I appreciate Ms. Hazard, because I know you're a part of that fight with Mr. Hazard to help make sure that, particularly the storm of the mass gravesite on 25th and Tamron is recognized, and engaging in the community to ensure people continue to preserve this site, and continue to know, what's in that ground, despite of, passing by there every day. So I appreciate you being on the line and your support that you've always shown me in this particular plight that we're on. So thank you for that.
I would like to say a few words, if I may.
Sure.
I appreciate your presentation, and also that the young people, they need to know the history, because if they don't know the history, we'll continue repeating what's going on. And not only the oral history, but the written history. That is why it's so important that we do have these discussions, we do talk with different people, all kinds of people, because we are in this together. If we don't move forward, we know what the end results will be. But in speaking of the mass grave at 25th Street and Tamron Avenue, we all know what the people had to do in order to bring it to where it is now. And it is not where it needs to be now. Like you were mentioning, Evergreen and the other cemeteries, we need to honor, remember, and respect those people that are buried wherever they are buried, because it is sacred ground. It is holy ground. And one of the things that we are working with Mr. Hazard and his coalition and other people in the community and throughout, because for the second national disaster in our nation to have taken place here in Palm Beach County, West Palm Beach, and
That's
Dr.
right.
Wynn has stated what that area has been in the past, but we are working toward making it be a place of learning, not only for the young people, but for the old people, for anybody. We're not leaving anybody out. We want everybody to be included, because right now we're dealing with phase 2 of that site up there. And whether you know it or not, we're working very diligently with everybody in the community that will work with us to get a memorial monument there. It is 2020, and the storm took place in 1928.
Wow.
So that's giving you some history. And we don't want to repeat the negativism of what's happened in the past. We are moving forward, and not only with that memorial monument, but when we get to phase 3. And I'm not going to take up a lot of your time, but if anybody's interested in working with us and helping us to move forward, they can contact us at the Storm of 28 Memorial Park Coalition, Inc. at Post Office Box 2186, West Palm Beach, Florida 33402. And we thank you so much for giving us this time to let you know how the coalition is working with everyone. We're not here for one particular group. We're working with people in the community and outside of the people in the community too that are working with us. We have people all over the world, I'll say at this point, that's working with us. And we thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Be
Thank you,
safe,
Ms. Hazard.
everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Hazard. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I'm so glad you were able to get on to share. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, Mr. Knowles, if there's nothing else, this wraps up my presentation. If you want to add any words to this and close this out, or and give any additional information, it's on you.
No, just thank you again, Dr. Nguyen. You've done a phenomenal job. I don't want to say too much to kind of take away from anything that you've done. Just think about all our participants who have viewed this session during our Summer Institute. And also, you put your contact information if anybody want additional information or have any additional questions. I know you even put, you had a slider here where you put books, so there's access that resources that people can access on their own.
Yes.
But key thing, all our participants, as you see, Dr. Nguyen's information there. She's local. She's an amazing anthropologist and historian right here as far as all the local history and anything in those subject areas. So thank you again, Dr. Nguyen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.